Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Ernest Becker Foundation webinar. My name is Lila Rothschild. I'm the program director at EBF. And for those who are not aware, the EBF examines the ways in which the human awareness of our own mortality affects our beliefs and behaviors on both an individual and societal level. So today we have with us Sheldon Solomon and Jason Mauro. I'm going to pass it over to Sheldon to introduce himself and the webinar.
Well, thank you, Lila, and welcome everybody. My name's Sheldon Solomon, and I teach psychology at Skidmore College. And as some of you may know, I along with Tom Pazinski and Jeff Greenberg, developed terror management theory in the 1980s to provide empirical support for Ernest Becker's claims about the pervasive role of death in life. And our intention always was to provide this evidence in large measure to encourage other people to become directly familiar with what we think are some of the most poignantly profound ideas of the last century and to this date. And today we're very fortunate to have Jason Mauro, professor of literature, literary theory, and film at the University of North Florida. And I had the good fortune to meet Jason, I think in 2008, when he invited me to lecture at UNF about our research demonstrating that death reminders increase American support for charismatic fascist political leaders, and to consider the ominous implications of those findings for the future of democracy. If we had more time, I'd point out that this is no less of a concern today than it was in yesteryear, and maybe even more. I was struck at my visit to UNF by Jason's good cheer, his generous hospitality, and in visiting his classes, his thorough command of Becker's ideas, and the way that he really nimbly integrated those ideas into his classes on literature and film. And moreover, I also found Jason's students at UNF to be magnificent. They were thoughtful, they were attentive, they were engaged. And to be a little bit nostalgic, I came away from UNF saying this is what education is supposed to be: thoughtful people exchanging ideas in an open-minded environment that makes civil disagreement not only okay, but encouraged. And yeah, what a contrast to today, where in Florida, as Jason will attest, truth and knowledge and intelligence are banned to the point where it is illegal to have an accurate depiction of reality. All right, be that as it may, Jason is currently writing a book called Inventing Death and teaches a course by that same name. And this webinar that we are fortunate to now partake of will be based on those ideas. Jason's going to bring us through an interactive presentation, and then there'll be time for Q&A. So if you got some questions, jot them down, and you can submit them on the chat to the right of your screen. And so thanks for coming, Jason, and we'll have a fine time.
And thank you. And am I audible? I can be heard. And it's a pleasure seeing you again, Sheldon, and meeting you kind of face to face, Lila. And I appreciate all the work that's gone into arranging this. And if nothing else comes out of this, I just want to be here to express my heartfelt thanks to the terror management theorists and the Ernest Becker Foundation, who have been just so influential in how I think, not only about academics, but about my life. And it's been such a great journey through the material that I owe you all a debt. And so it's a thrill for me to be here and chat with you all. If I can ask, the first thing I do in any classes of mine is to ask people to do something just a little more engaged than just hearing me rant. And that is this: if everyone listening would get a piece of paper and a pen. And if you would, when I say go, I'm going to give you 45 seconds, and I'll do it too. Draw a self-portrait. Draw yourself. Draw a picture of yourself. 5 seconds gone already. Make sure those details are you. Still got plenty of time, 30 seconds. Make it distinctly you. Almost done. Get those last little eyelashes in there. And halt. Thank you very much for indulging me. And normally I would have all my students show it to the camera. So if you guys would show it to the camera. There's Sheldon right there. There's Lila. I like it. And here's me.
What?
So no, no. Here's me. That's mine. And I want to kind of use this just opportunity to look at our self-portraits as a kind of text in relation to some of what Becker has to say, and in relation to somewhat people that follow Becker have to say in ways that I think provide a really interesting interference pattern. And my job as a literary theorist, literary critic, whatever the hell I am, is to sort of jam words together and see what they do together. And so I'd like to walk through a couple of observations from Becker and kind of nail down the economy and the beauty and the necessity of what the terror management theorists are working on, and then apply to that some other stuff that I've been reading that I find really interesting, and see what squeezes out of that interaction. And the necessity of this, as Sheldon was saying, is just ever more present. I mean, the level of fear that is governing the most minute and the most national interactions is just horrendous. I mean, even these two shootings that have just happened, somebody rings a doorbell, gets shot in the head. Somebody drives down the wrong driveway and gets killed for this defensive compensatory reaction to a perceived threat that is so slight that is regarded as life and limb. And so the need for us to really interrogate how it is we see ourselves, how it is we navigate that fear, is just made ever more plain by the most current of events. So here's me. That's how I think of myself. That's how yeah. And normally what I would do too is have all my students kind of put them up against the cameras. And so we can get this collective portrait. And I always think that if I kind of had transparencies and laid them over each other so we could get what's common about them, we would end up with something like this. My human being right there. That's a diagram that I use in a lot of my classes to sort of get a sense of, you know, Becker's kernel, his kind of root postulate. And that is, we are creatures on a planet, things in an environment. And that's okay, but there's one little dipsy doodle that happens, and that is we're self-conscious creatures on a planet. And I've put this little indentation here in the bean to reflect that. If it was a diagram of my dog, I would put a circle, and I don't think my dog has as much of a self-image as me, but that little curve represents either my frontal cortex able to sort of abstractly think, or just me looking down at my feet and me saying, I am here. My dog doesn't do that. And that self-consciousness, that this object will disappear, is, according to Becker, and I hope I'm not rehearsing too much of what everybody already knows, toxic, unassimilable, that it's emotionally, psychologically, and just even cognitively impossible to imagine the removal and absence of that object. And Becker has, a number of ways of articulating this. As an animal organism, man senses the kind of planet he has been put down on, and that planet is devouring. That planet is digesting. Admit that you are a creature, and that's the admission we can't seem to get to even through Becker. We have these, I always draw it as kind of shields of, cultural, fashion, kind of force fields that we generate out there to keep us from that sense of being creatures. One is, and here's the, maybe the most poignant, one is frightened by the emptiness, the gap that would be left by one's disappearance, the stark tenor of losing oneself as a disappearing object. Again, creatures on a planet. And again, the consequences of that the terror management theorists have generated, the rooting of that observation to violence, to discrimination, to everything, I think is just, in some ways, the most important work on the planet. I've been looking at some of the manifestations of what many people call the Gilgamesh Project, the Immortality Project, funded by sort of phantom billionaires who are trying to sort of extend their lives. And that's so, in some ways, sad, desperate, and unfortunate. And so I'm encouraging everyone who listens to shift some of our money and dig deep and support the Ernest Becker Foundation for its, I think, far more important work of trying to sort of mitigate and just adjust us to our real situation on the planet. So Becker wrote this 50 years ago. And I want to just look at some things that have happened since then and try and tuck them into either maybe as a contrast or a continuity with Becker's stuff. And the first thing I'd like to do is just look at a line, if I can get it up here. There it is, from Ernest Becker. I mean, not from Ernest Becker, from Michel Foucault. So let me share my screen. And I hope everybody can see that. This is from a book he wrote called The Order of Things. And it's rather presumptuously called The Archaeology of Human Knowledge. And it deserves that presumption. It's a fascinating, unbelievably capacious book. Well beyond my understanding in most aspects of it, but there are some things that I just love about it that I'd like to rehearse. And so I want to just read this quote that opens up his book. This book arose out of a passage in Borges, out of the laughter that shattered as I read the passage, all the familiar landmarks of my thought, our thought, the thought that bears the stamp of our age in our geography, breaking up all the ordered surfaces and all the planes with which we are accustomed to tame the wild profusion of existing things and continuing long afterward to disturb and threaten with collapse our age-old distinction between the same and the other. This passage quotes a certain Chinese encyclopedia in which it is written that animals are divided into A, belonging to the emperor, B, embalmed, C, tame, D, sucking pigs, sirens, fabulous, stray dogs, included in the present classification, frenzied, innumerable, drawn with a very final camel hair brush, etc., and having just broken the water pitcher, and that from a long way off look like flies. In the wonderment of this taxonomy, the thing we apprehend in one great leap, the thing that by means of a fable is demonstrated as the exotic charm of another system of thought, is the limitation of our own, the stark impossibility of thinking that. And I want to just kind of apply that a little bit. Just how can we take what categories we assume And I want to apply them to our self-portraits, at least my self-portrait. So I'm going to stop sharing for a moment just because and forgive me, I'm not terribly good at manipulating a Zoom screen. There it is. So I want to just look at our self-portraits and ask why we didn't draw certain other things. And so here's one. I don't think anybody drew this. This is a face mite. And we can regard it as kind of a hyper close-up. You have colonies of these in your eyebrows, or if you have a beard, it's thousands of them eating away at the oil and the flesh on your face, and you wouldn't look as good as you do without them. They're a sort of legion and colony. So this is kind of a hyper close-up that we sort of calls to mind that in some ways Foucaultian vision that, oh, we have a certain convention within which we're looking at ourselves. We don't zoom in that close. I always go to this one too. This is another possible way of drawing a self-portrait. In fact, this is a group self-portrait. This is, if you could see this little dot here, that's Earth from the perspective of Mars from the rover. And I think NASA on the day that picture was taken asked anybody on the right side of the planet to wave because it was the sort of longest scale group portrait that had ever been taken. And so again, we have these kind of cinematic ranges within which I assume, I can't see, I wish I could see all of your self-portraits, but I assume we draw our self-portraits, either full shoulder, bodies, faces, or something. But it's not from a long way off look like flies, or from hyper close up, we see the face mites. And there's another self-portrait that I think is even more interesting to me, a variation of those categories within which we think of ourselves. And that is, if I have that up here, this is when Ernst Mach was given the assignment of draw a self-portrait. This is what he drew. And I find this extraordinary. I don't think about this when somebody says, draw me, represent me. Matter of fact, I eclipse all of this from my attention when I go to draw the object that is me. I close down my perceptions and sort of focus on this internalized object. And that is one of those moments that I think Foucault laughs about. It's like, oh, can we actually consider that to be us? Our immediate perceptions, the thing that's out here, and how far can we go with that? And I in some ways contrast that, but also want to sort of weave it into some observations that Becker makes as well. That when Mach was told, draw a self-portrait, he drew everything else. And if it was the next second, it would be a different portrait. If he went outside and now draw a self-portrait, we'd be seeing something completely different. This world is activating his phenomenological position in the world, his senses. How far can we go with that? And so I give my students another dumb thought experiment. I say, get a good picture of your liver in your mind. Just think about your liver. All its glistening maroon glory or whatever it is. Get a good picture of it. And then I say the obvious thing, that can't be your liver. You'll never see your liver like that. That's not you. If you saw your liver like that, you would not be seeing your liver like that because you'd be dead. Your liver appears to you in all of its livering function, like all of this, all of the phenomenon that are interacting your sentences. This cup is more my liver than that thing that I was imagining. That this, in some ways, I can regard from that, again, Foucaultian perspective as my body enacted. And I just have always been curious about how that interacts with Becker. Because it's moving a little aside from that notion of creatures on a planet. If what we derive initially from our experience is all of this, then even creatures on a planet, I'm tempted to start to tuck into a category of, oh, is that an abstraction? Is our real situation on the planet, if this is my real situation on the planet, is this, in some ways, can that be tucked into the category that Becker so beautifully develops of a vital lie? And I wonder what the consequences of that are. I wonder what the consequences are of that are to my own fears, my own anxieties. That if I don't regard this object as the disappearing act, but as sort of this field at which I'm and all of you are the center, that phenomenological field, does that do anything in terms of the reflexive and defensive and horrible violent fear that we are always enacting? I wanted to go back to, where is that now? Nope, nope, nope. There it is. Hold on. There. This is what begins Foucault's book, this paragraph. I'm going to give you the very end of it. And the middle of it is, oh my God, it's such a wrestling match, but I recommend it really highly because it's just this incredibly rich, weird, beautiful archaeology of almost everything. But here's the quote at the end of the book. As the archaeology of our thought easily shows, man is an invention of a recent date, man as object of our own knowledge, and one perhaps nearing its end. One can certainly wager that man will be erased like a face drawn in sand at the edge of the sea. The category within which we think of ourselves as object. And I find that beautifully weird and emancipatory in some measures, and puzzling. How would I live enacting that forgotten sense of me as this kind of corpse of my memory, or mirror image out of which I've derived this, or photograph out of which I've derived this? What would it be? I mean, it would, in some ways, I think that's where Becker tends to go with, but maybe doesn't fully complete with Kierkegaard. That the gesture of faith in Kierkegaard's move is to die every second. To have that self-portrait of Ernst Mach redirected and taken seriously and monitored at every moment. So it's not that this object dies. Every second is a death and a rebirth. And so in some ways, it's not less terrifying, Foucault's vision, than the Beckerian vision of, trying to imagine my disappearance. I don't have to imagine it. It's happening at every moment. And so I love how these two texts interact in that way. I think Becker begins to sort of, he both articulates sort of a postulate where creatures on a planet, but we're enabled with lenses of reading him that let us go back and reread those sentences. Creatures, what's a creature? That which is created, almost bears the stamp of almost an Old Testament kind of And I wondered if Foucault would say, I'm not sure that that's he would say that itself is kind of an abstraction. I also would like to just bring in, for our purposes, just a couple of moments from Judith Butler, who I also like. And I think she's too is a kind of post-humanist in this way, that challenging the very category of what a human is, in some ways substituting the phenomenological field out of which we condense the object of ourselves. And here, I mean, a couple quotes from her, and then I won't go on too long. The body is a historical situation. I think of myself, I'm skipping down to this one. Am I sharing? Am I still sharing? Yes. If I think of myself not just as this bounded individual, but as fundamentally related to others, then I locate this self in those relations. In that case, the self I am trying to defend is not just me, but all those relations that define and sustain me. And those relations can and should be extended indefinitely beyond local units like family and community. If the self I'm trying to defend is also in some sense related to the person I've attempted to kill, I have to make sure not to do violence to that relation, because that's also me. I'm going to pause right here, and I want to just show a very quick video clip, and then I'll end a couple of minutes, and then I'll love to hear what people are reflecting on in this kind of engagement of texts. So let me see if I can get to just a video clip. Hold on, I stopped sharing. Got to close this. Got to open this. Ah, there it is. Hold on. Make sure to share the sound too. Yes, indeed. Share sound. Share this. Share this. Share. There we go. And this to me is a really beautiful metaphor for the kind of impossible interrelatedness that both, I think, Foucault and Judith Butler are talking about. I was in New York City one time, and I was walking past tables of three-card Monte people, and they were kind of assembling bets and stuff like that. And this one guy was behind a table, and he had just a jar of bubble stuff and a couple of those wands that you blow stuff through. And he was betting people. He said, I bet you I can blow a cubic bubble. And it was like, oh, you got to get a frame, and you're going to just dump it in soap water. And then it's, no, just with these two wands, I'm going to blow a bubble that's in the shape of a cube. And of course, it's a sucker's bet, but I put down my $5. A lot of people did. And he did it just like I'm about to show you. Just want to pause there for a moment. He blew smoke into what is a cubic bubble that is nested within this other series of 6 or 8 bubbles that he's blown. You know, you blow 2 bubbles and there's that flat surface. He constructed a cubic bubble out of those united flat surfaces. And I think of this in relation to Judith Butler and, again, Michel Foucault, and the disappearance of a category, or at least the sort of challenging of a certain category. That cubic bubble is not transportable out of that circumstance. I mean, I could think of myself floating in space, right? But I couldn't ever be floating in space, because I would be turned inside out and my blood would boil. I mean, I am a function of being squeezed into shape by the very atmosphere, by the very gravity. I am not distinguishable from this environment. I am an artifact of it. And I love this image of a cubic bubble because in some ways it is made of its external faculties. It's a virtual presence. It's not an actual presence. And there's something so deeply, deeply comforting to me about perhaps trying to, I mean, I'll never feel that way. I'll never believe it. Our culture is just too heavily invested in me feeling like this kind of creature in a bag of skin walking around with, bag of guts. I'll never feel that way. But to some extent, I see theory moving in almost the opposite direction of what might be called religion. Religion, in some ways, is believing in things you can't know. But I'm becoming so persuaded of this kind of absence of categories or this mixing of categories that it's like I'm beginning to know something that I can't believe. I'll never feel it. Like the people who are investigating the lack of free will right now. It's like nobody feels that way. We all feel like we have free will, even though it seems to be disappearing. And so I wonder, just large scale, long term, that knowledge as opposed to our belief, our felt sense, is there some way that that might mitigate or help or leaven some of the, I think the guy that was shooting through the door or shooting through the car wasn't feeling that embeddedness, but only that isolation, imagining that that cubic bubble can exist apart from its entire environment and universe of surroundings. With that, I'm going to shut up. I notice our time is beginning to move along. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to ask Sheldon, I don't know if this is making any sense or what I can go back and clarify and whatever. Be happy to answer any questions that folks may have.
Well, it makes sense to me, Jason, but that's because we're kind of nerds. I'm going to toss up, if you can see, I'm going to share a screen. Can you see that? I'm assuming other people might be able to also. So this is my class today in reference to Judith Butler. So maybe you and I are on some weird synchronicity. But this is, for me, whatever you said is quite magnificent and dovetails with what I've been thinking. And so here's Judith Butler talking about our radical interdependency. I'll stop sharing, but this is just to second what you've been saying. And you make a brilliant point, I think, and that's when you point out knowing something that's hard to believe, because basically, you get the Judith Butlers of the world who are literally pointing out the degree of dependence, not only humans with each other, but the degree to which we depend on the environment in which we're completely enmeshed. And to the average American, that just sounds like socialist voodoo. In other words, as people who are ensconced in a cultural worldview that venerates the autonomous individual, it seems inconceivable that we're part of a world that we're all interrelated, and certainly not desirable in any way, shape, or form. And yet the fact of the matter is that that's backwards. This idea that we're autonomous individuals is one of the few unambiguously wrong and stupid ideas in the history of science. In other words, John Locke, despite his great virtues, is wrong when he says that in the old days there were no societies, only individuals. We have always been uber social, hyper cooperative, interdependent creatures. And that was Otto Ranke's point when he declared us all to be temporal representatives of the cosmic primal
Right.
force. And he's like, yo, we're all descended from life form number one. We're therefore all connected to all that is, everything ever alive, everything now alive, everything that's gonna be alive. And so this like idea that is often dismissed as kind of like hippie nostalgia, or Judith Butler type radical interdependence, yeah, that's in fact absolutely true. And most of us in our finer moments know it.
Right.
And that indeed does raise the question of why it is that we're in this bind right now, where a lot of us end up leaning in the direction of believing things that one can't know.
Right.
And the hope would be in accord with what you've said, Jason. I think that this is a potentially promising way to think about things. And some of the research that we're doing on our end right now is exploring that possibility. We wonder if getting people to recognize, as you know, as Heidegger noted, that we get tossed into the world, and before we even wake up, we're completely enmeshed and engaged with it, and that we can and should be making headway, that, and so we're trying to do some experiments to just
Oh, I want to
see
know.
if pointing out our fundamental connectedness with nature, with each other, with ourselves, could that do anything to help us assuage death anxiety? We believe that it can.
Yeah. And I wonder if that's the direction toward which the most recent work, even in, say, psychedelics and death anxiety, that there's a way in which the hyperplasticization that provided by, say, psilocybin, as people are sort of panicking about the disappearance of this object, I get a little, I'm wondering, it always seems like the vocabulary around that from the clinicians is, oh, it helps reduce anxiety and it helps sort of modify the horror. But from the accounts I read, what people are accounting for is that exact sense that it's not sort of this hallucinatory thing. It's a revelation of that connectedness. And I wonder if that's the direction where psychedelic research and death anxiety might go too.
Well, it's exactly gone there. So I can send things to anybody that is interested, and I'll certainly send them your way. There is some recent work. There's a lot of recent work suggesting that single experiences with psychedelics have tremendous and enduring effects in terms of reducing anxiety and depression. And it turns out that what mediates those effects is a reduction of death anxiety. And so I like how you're putting this today, Jason, that Becker's central claim about the role of death in life remains as he originally articulated it. And of course, Becker's point was never that we should just devote our lives to confirming his ideas mindlessly, because it was 50 years ago, and I think his ideas stand up quite
absolutely
well, empirically and otherwise. On the other hand, I find your take on these matters quite enriching, because the Beckerian depiction of a cultural worldview, and this is unfair to Becker, but it sure does sound kind of Cartesian, like a disembodied observer looking out on all that is from a detached perspective. And that has nothing to do with the reality of the human condition, which is much more like the way that you, vis-a-vis Foucault and Butler, have depicted it.
And initially, when I first started to investigate this relationship, I did think of it as oppositional, and now I think it's perfectly complementary. That there's a way in which, well, first of all, Becker says we're not supposed to, let's not oppose, but to include in a larger theoretical structure any new information that's coming out, and that's his whole gesture. It's like just expansive. And I
Yes.
think, I mean, we're unfortunately we're stuck with a snapshot of 1973, and
Yes.
the vocabulary might be like you suggested with the mental health chapters. They're like anachronistic. We could tear them out of the book.
Yeah.
So I think some of the vocabulary moves toward, but doesn't quite get there yet.
Yes.
And so that's kind of where my course goes. It's like to extend his sense of our meanings are built into us from the outside. And in
Yeah.
some ways, this cubic bubble thing is like, oh, the ultimate expression of that. We are the meanings of the
Nice.
outside. We're the interference pattern across these meanings instead
That's
of some
nice.
kernel thing that we have inside.
Yes. All right. Awesome. So we got some very fine questions coming in from the folks in the ethereal mist. All right. Here's one. How might you share some of these concepts with those fast approaching death, cancer patient, assuming that would somehow ease their pain?
Let me
Wow.
say this. You catch me in extremis right now. I am a cancer patient.
Wow.
Between the time I was invited to do this talk and now, I've gotten a fairly brutal diagnosis of a
Wow.
kind of lymphoma. And so I am a living kind of example of how to try and navigate this. And to me, it's an oscillation. I'm at my most terrified and my most scared as I think about sort of the loss of, I don't know, who I am, this thing, this puzzling absence. But when I'm actually paying attention to what's out here, that helps move myself outside of it. Like I'm playing with my dog, just as assume this character of something else. Like he's another me. I'm not, my disappearance reduces when I think I'm actually in the presence of my coffee cup and my dog. But it's a tough act because, I mean, again, the whole culture will invest in me as this body inside something. And that's when I get when I identify with that, I get terrified. I can't imagine that loss. So I think that's a great question, and I'm right in the middle of it. And can I tell a quick joke
Please.
about that? Here's something my dad told me when I was 3 years old, and it's good. I'm going to have to condense it and fly by quick, but it's really important to me. 3 people go into a hotel. They want rooms. Hotel manager says there's only one. They each pay $10 for the room, go upstairs. Manager feels guilty, says, hey, bell captain, come over here. Here's $5. Give it back to the folks upstairs. Bell captain on the way up the stairs says, how am I going to divide $5 by 3 people? I'm going to put 2 in my pocket for a tip. So he goes back, knocks on the door. Here's the $1 for you, $1 for you, $1 for you. Now they've each paid $9 for the room. 9 times 3 is 27, plus the 2 the bell captain has in his pocket, 28, 29. Where's the extra $1? And I love that joke. My dad told me that when I was 10. And of course, there's not, it's a bait and switch. I'm miscounting things and stuff like that. But what I love about it is that the feeling of absence and loss is a function of how the problem has been formulated. That nothing is missing. There's nothing that really goes in that formulation. I can formulate a problem where that felt sense of loss is in some way structural more than it is real, if that makes any sense. I don't know if that makes any sense, but.
No, nicely done. And for folks out there that might be interested, I'm giving a talk, if they let me in the country, in Japan next week to a group of palliative care oncologists. And it's really about the intersection of Becker's ideas and our work with treatment of folks at the end of life. And so not to bog things down, but if anybody would like to see what about
Feed me anything you
yeah,
got.
I'll send that to you, Jason. But we got more great questions.
Yeah.
All right, here's a fine one. Was it intentional that you made us draw our faces? As Becker wrote in Escape from Evil about how the uniqueness of our faces lends towards our importance and power.
Yeah, I think faces are a really interesting thing. And there's a book I love by Jacques Derrida called Memoirs of the Blind, where he's looking at self-portraiture.
Yep.
And one of his italicized lines, I just have I want to put on a bumper sticker. It's like the naked face cannot look itself in the face. That to some extent, when we are out here, I don't have a face when I'm looking at you. I'm effaced. That my experience, my construction of a face is always kind of a post facto thing. It's always, I'm looking at a camera, I'm looking in the mirror, looking at a photograph. My Ernst Mach experience of a face, what I reflexively go to when I say me, that selfie, is not me, according to Ernst Mach. And so, yes, it is. I mean, and so I also give you like 45 seconds because I think when we're rushed, we fall back on our most basic assumptions. We fall back on our most kind of reflexive drawing. And that's what I do every time. It's like, that's me.
Wow.
But according to these folks, that's not me.
So I like that. Not that anybody could see this, but this is my phone, and this is my self-portrait
Oh, I love
on
it.
my phone, and that's me, that little speck walking into the woods. And now, if I could draw that, which I can't, that's my current depiction of myself. And so when you were going through your marvelous presentation, I was like, wow, I get it. And it was partly for me just kind of thinking about Heidegger's take, where he's like, most of us are imprisoned in our, disembodied eyeball sense of self that really does obscure our kaleidoscopic connections with all that is. It's, by the way, why I show the students in my class, we look at Picasso's art, and everybody's like, wow, Cubism, that's like so crazy. And I have to find it, but Picasso did an interview at one point where he's like, they're like, why are you doing all of this like crazy distorted shit? And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. Cubism is actually hyper realism.
Right.
I want you to imagine what something would look like if you viewed it from all perspectives simultaneously.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. As opposed to that myopic, limited, and false perspective.
Yes.
That our eyeballs create.
There you go. That's
right.
So, yeah, well put. And again, not to, well, you're the literary dude, but I can't remember. Oh, we just did, we were reading, Rollo May's Cry for Myth, describing the Oedipus. And the prophet is blind. It's always the case that the folks who are most insightful are not imprisoned by their eyeballs in their head at a particular angle in a particular moment. All right, we got a cool question. Is it truly connectedness that is needed, or a way to feel self-esteem in a culture such as ours, which is disintegrating?
Boy, that's a tough one, man.
Yeah.
Because I mean, in some ways, I think there's different notions of self-esteem, I think, there's a kind of an American sense of self-esteem, but there's also a kind of continental self-esteem in psychoanalysis. And that's a tough one. I think we're a lot of self-esteem stuff, bolstering your ego to match the cultural expectations is palliative, really nice. I want to feel, sort of like I'm doing a good job here, even in this talk, right? And that will enhance my self-esteem. And if I screw it up and if I'm illegible, it's like my self-esteem will go down. But in some ways, is that a different self from what's being articulated? Like the self-esteem of something embedded like this cubic bubble, the self-esteem of the connections that I have with all of this stuff. I mean, that self seems to be, I think that would be enhanced by the connections.
I would too. Again, I'm kind of I'm a nerd, and yesterday I was teaching Becker's Birth and Death and Meaning, and we were discussing his take on neurosis, which he describes as an inevitable product of socialization. And his point is that, that basically socialization consists ultimately of reducing anxiety by subscribing to a particular cultural construction,
Right.
Which he argues is a trade. It renders you more comfortable, but it does ultimately restrict experience, in his language, by skewing perception and limiting action. And again, this is one of the things we're on our end currently musing about, both theoretically as well as empirically. We're like, sure, culturally constructed ways of feeling good, as you put it, Jason, those feel good. On the other hand, we also live in a culture that has standards of value that are not realistically attainable for the average individual, a recipe for psychological despair, reflected in the fact that the average American is depressed or inebriated or out shopping. And so I think that it may be a good idea to, in a sense, and again, this is with all due respect, Becker's original conception of self-esteem was framed in terms of heroism. And I don't dispute that, but I would like to broaden the scope of means to acquire a sense of meaning and value. And I believe that there's nothing incompatible with Becker's ideas there. And it actually blends well with the work coming out of positive psychology, just showing how awe and gratitude and humility all reduce the defensive reactions that death reminders otherwise provoke. And again, at the risk of sounding silly, I'm like, you remind people they're going to die, and they hate people that are different. They vote for folks like Orange Hitler. I mean, Donald Trump for president. They deny that we're animals. They piss on the environment. They become mindless consumers. Well, none of that is good. But if we remind people to be grateful, or just ask them to think about how awesome life is when you're connected cosmically to all things around you, well, that minimizes those defensive reactions. And it's on those grounds that I would say that true connectedness may be the superordinate psychological construct upon which psychological equanimity resides. Remembering that we started in the world as a connection. You were conceived as a connection. And so this idea that we are or unconnected is, frankly, ignorance of human development.
There's a burgeoning field in literary theory called new materialism.
Yes.
And to a certain extent, it's looking at the rhetoric of how we've undersold our descriptions of even matter.
Yes.
But to some extent, matter, if we look back, sort of in our ability to look at the prehistory, is pre-conscious.
Yes.
And have we rendered it in our rhetoric more inert, perhaps?
Yes.
Than we have good reason to suspect.
Wow. All right. So here's two questions. Probably it could be our last ones if we're going to pay attention to time. These are, I'm being silly, but I'm staring at these questions and I'm like, if we could answer these, we'd be chugging rum out of our coconuts on a beach with our Nobel Prize. Okay, so number one, Becker calls them vital lies. It doesn't seem a given then that life would be better without these lies. How do we balance reality with vital lies?
Right. That is, that's a great question.
Absolutely.
Man, And I think about, I mean, in some ways, post-structuralist thought, post-humanist thought has ushered in a kind of facile post-truth world, right?
Yes.
And in some ways, people take that as license to sort of make up fables and lie and construct our own realities. And I think that's a facile engagement with this kind of humbling dismantling.
Yes.
And I think if we could have like an empirically true rendering of our connections, and I don't know, you say your truth with absolute conviction on the evidence you have, knowing. I mean, that's in some ways the vital part, isn't it?
Yeah.
Knowing that it's going to fall, that you're always going to be provisional. You humbly say your thing with every bit of information and research and data and conviction you have. And the humility is in knowing that that is always provisional.
I think that's right. And I wish for so many reasons that I was aware of Becker when he was alive, or that he might even be alive now. But I wonder if he wouldn't use a different word than lie, because I think vital lies comes from the birth and death of meaning. By the denial of death, Becker's talking more at the end of the denial of death. He says we need bold, creative myths that that encourage us. Stick a hyphen between and courage, and at the same time, do not obscure the truth about our finitude. So, all right, let's get to the second question here. Would it be better to have the perspective of no self, such as the Buddhist perspective, and or better to view the self as existing but universal?
Boy, I mean, yeah, those are huge, beautiful questions. And and in some ways, our vocabulary, doesn't it, breaks down.
Yeah.
Limited to a kind of subject-object dualism at work in the very language we speak that is always contaminating, perhaps the fluidity and vicissitudes of our experience in that way. So I think either of those poles, being no self or in some ways non-existent, are still embedded in a kind of language that depends on a certain sort of presence.
Yeah.
And so I think language itself is just this thing for me, it's always been the thing to study. It bears the trace of a lot of our questions.
Yeah, there you go. So you were talking earlier, Jason, and I'm scribbling because I'm like Wittgenstein, he who understands me recognizes the meaninglessness of my propositions. And I always say that to the students, and they're like, what the fuck are you talking about, dude? And it's like, well, what I'm talking about is that we're using words to describe what are non-linguistic processes. And we need to understand that whether we like it or not, that language is embedded in language, are implicit and explicit assumptions about the world that may have little to do with it. And I think this is, again, this is an area that might be quite rich, just to be not so much annoying, but provocative. Could it be that what's best is an oscillation between these perspectives?
No, I love that.
Instead of like, again, the Cartesian way, which is linear and one thing after another, why not go Eastern? Like Henry Miller of the last century, one of my favorite books is Stand Still Like the Hummingbird.
Flickering. We're flickering in between those two states.
I want to study flickering.
I love that
kind of flickering.
Yeah. No, I think that's really powerful.
I do too. Now, I don't know, Lila, if you're there, I don't know if we should be wrapping up at this point. Are we paying attention to time?
Yes, we'll do the final question.
Ooh, okay. Do we have one more?
Yep, coming in.
All right, here we go. Anyway, while that's happening, Jason, I do hope we can get together. I'm hoping to be like in your end of the woods. The pandemic was tough for
yeah. No. I would love it. Even if it's just a more extended Zoom call, man. I'd love to speak to you.
So let's catch up. All right, final question. You both have mentioned some of the healthier outlets you use to cope with the rumble of terror that underlies everything. Can you summarize your favorite strategies: nature, creativity, writing, books, spirituality, etc.? All of those for me.
Yeah, all of those for me too. And what I've taken, phenomenology seems to have gripped me in a way that I want to investigate further. And that is, if I'm feeling dreadful, I'm looking around for something to feel dreadful about. And part of me needs to like just say, oh, that's what adrenaline feels like. What I'm feeling right now is not this threat, it's adrenaline. And so to try and cope with, in some ways, sensation in its most basic form, instead of the attributions of that I normally make about anger and fear with regard to my anxieties. But that's hard because we're not trained to do it.
No, that's right. And that was awesome, Jason. And real quickly, for me, my daily goal is just to appreciate being, as maybe silly as that sounds. I'll call it gratitude, but I would like to get to the point. Today was beautiful here in upstate New York. And like you said earlier, I'm proud if I do something professionally and it's recognized. Self-esteem, good. So was today, where I walked outside on a beautiful day and got a face full of fresh air and said hello to my neighbors. In other words, when I can get to the point where all of these strategies, taking a walk, doing something creative, writing a book, petting the dog, I think that that they are all potentially healthy outlets. All right, let's do this. Let me thank you, Jason, for being here with us. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that you will be as receptive to thoughts from folks
absolutely
at UNF as I am at Skidmore. Like all of our gatherings, I thought this was magnificent. I hope it's just a substrate for future exchanges. And at the risk of sounding silly, nothing would please me more than for all of us to, at some vaguely unspecified future moment, be actually in an embodied circumstance where we're near each other. So
let us work on that.
And thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone, for attending this webinar. And as Sheldon said, you're welcome to reach out with questions that we didn't get to today, or reach out to the EBF and we'll put you in touch. If you enjoyed this webinar, make sure to sign up for our mailing list if you're not on there already, and feel free to donate as well to support future webinars.
Dig deep.
So thank you so much. See you next time. All right, we are ended.